Okay, hello and welcome to the virtual Peoria Riverfront Museum. My name is Zach Zetterberg. I am the curator of art and the Center for American Decoys here at the museum. And tonight I'm here to host the first of 3 live guitar sessions with HP Newquist. HP is, first of all, the director of the National Guitar Museum. And he's also the mastermind behind a exciting exhibit that we are proud to be bringing to Peoria later this year in September. And we're going to kind of start things off by learning a little bit more about HP and his collection, about the exhibition, and go from there the next 2 Wednesdays with some more in-depth analysis of the acoustic and the electric guitar. And I think it's going to be great. With that being said, let's introduce Mr. Newquist himself, our new guitar guru. And welcome to the virtual Peoria Riverfront Museum.
Thanks, Zach. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. Before we kick things off, HP, I've got to recognize a few people here that help us bring these exhibits to our museum, and that's and the folks that sponsored this exhibit are Illinois Mutual and PNC, and our Corporate Visionary Society. And you know, we couldn't do projects like this. We wouldn't be talking right now without that help. And also the Visionary Society members of the museum, and all the members of the museum, they make this happen. So thank you to everybody, and you know, anybody that's tuning in tonight, thank you for your help in every way. So HP, let's I think I'd like to start off, and let's talk about the National Guitar Museum. Can you tell us what it's all about?
Well, the National Guitar Museum was founded now 11 years ago with the intent of preserving and promoting the legacy of the guitar. The reason we even started a museum is that even though the guitar is the world's most popular instrument, there were no museums devoted to the guitar. There are teacup museums and dollhouse museums and ventriloquist dummy museums. There's 4 barbed wire museums in America, but there were no museums dedicated to the guitar. And we decided that if anybody was going to do it, that a few of us who'd been in the guitar industry for a while should kind of combine our resources and create something that would preserve the legacy of the guitar. The problem was that in 2009, prior to the current pandemic, it was the worst economic time since the Great Depression to put together a museum or any other business. So what we did, since we'd already started building the museum and we planned on putting it here in New York City, we decided to take it on the road. And that way we could expose the idea to different cities all over the country through different museums such as Peoria Riverfront, and really create some interest in the idea of the guitar as a fixture of a museum. So for the last 10 years now, the museum has traveled across the country in a couple of different exhibits. We've been to 40 different cities. Several million people have seen it now. And we had plans to create a brick and mortar building, but we keep getting booked to keep being on the road. So as long as we can keep the guitars on the road,
yeah,
probably be a while before we have an actual brick and mortar building.
Yeah, it seems like it's working out pretty well.
It is.
Well, let's take a look at our next slide here. So HP, what, you know, I mean, you kind of just talked about it, but maybe more why the guitar for you? Like what got you interested? How'd you start collecting?
Well, I think the guitar, almost everybody, at least in America and perhaps most of the world, has a relationship to the guitar. Either they play, or they had a family member who played, or a friend played, or they just love guitar music, or they love music in general that was created on the guitar. And the guitar is by far the world's most popular instrument. There are 3 million guitars sold every year in America alone. And that is more than all other instruments combined. If you take pianos and cellos and drums and saxophones and everything you can think of and combine them, it's still not as many as all of the guitars that are sold in America. So we felt that, again, given our background on the guitar, that it was time to really celebrate it. And you ask about my background, I was the editor-in-chief of Guitar Magazine during the 1990s and had established a large number of contacts, not only with artists and manufacturers, but with the record labels back when there were record labels, and people who were interested in promoting the guitar, MTV and VH1 when they did music. So ultimately we realized that if there was anybody who was going to sort of preserve that legacy of the guitar, it would be people from my generation. And we had the wherewithal and the connections to make it happen. So that's kind of what brings us to where we are today.
Very cool. Very cool. Let's see. I find the guitar pretty interesting because as an artist, I'm the curator of art here. A lot of museums that I do visit, large museums, you don't often see at least contemporary guitars in museums. You see very antique instruments, maybe.
Right.
I find it interesting that the most popular instrument in the world doesn't get a whole lot of attention, and that it is really a functional sculpture in a way.
Well, it's funny because the guitar in its various forms has been around for hundreds of years as a guitar and thousands of years as a variety of stringed instruments that preceded the guitar. But the guitar itself, especially the electric guitar, didn't take off until the 1950s. And even places like Juilliard, which teach classical music, didn't teach classical guitar until I think it was only maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. And that's because the guitar was always looked at as being a commoner's instrument, you know, something that almost anybody could learn to pick up and play. It didn't require years and years of study. So when you see guitars in museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, they do tend to be very classical and ornately sculpted and crafted guitars, and not so much the modern guitars, which really are representative of our culture today. Part of that's because they're mass produced. Part of it is because there's so many of them. You know, where do you start? And one of the things that we're doing in the Riverfront is sort of showing why individual guitars are really special and why they're all different from each other.
So let's go ahead and move to our next image here. And I think that kind of leads us right into this. Can you just talk about, what, so these are shots from previous exhibits and other places. Can you tell us what somebody can expect to see?
Well, this is a good example of basically how we set up each museum exhibit when we go into places like we're going to do in Peoria. You'll see rows and rows of guitars, each one incredibly different from the next, and instruments that perhaps you've never seen before. We have charangos, which are little guitars made out of armadillo shells. We have guitars that are made out of carbon fiber and plexiglass. So in addition to the things that you typically see the guitar in terms of its shape and with artists, we've really tried to look at the entire history. And so as you look at these two pictures, you know, you see there's a balalaika in the bottom there, and there in the middle of the top picture is a sitar guitar, and then to the right of that is a synthesizer guitar. So we've assembled for your museum some 70 plus guitars that really show the diversity of how the guitar has evolved from this very simple instrument several hundred years ago, to being this wildly insanely decorative yet functional musical instrument today.
Very cool. I'm going to show another shot here of what you can expect for sure here in Peoria. Right away, you see that giant flying V. That is the world's largest guitar, correct? Playable guitar?
It is. It's not a sign. It's an actual guitar. It was made by an academy, a science academy in Houston, Texas, now probably 15 years or so ago. And they purposely created it with the intent to be the world's largest playable guitar. So it has strings, it can be played. The sound is not necessarily something that you're going to enjoy.
Yeah.
The strings are actually over 20 feet long.
Oh, wow.
So they're subsonic. We actually have to boost them with a digital set of signals. So instead of it being something lovely like you would hear for, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, it sounds more like maybe a UFO crashing into a mountainside. But it does play, and you can fret it and give it a try. But that does travel with us, and it's 43.5 feet long.
Wow.
Weighs almost 2 tons, which is about the size of a Mini Cooper.
Wow. Great. Can you talk about, I know there are some, it's not just guitars, correct? I mean, you're going to learn about a lot of the pillars of our museum, I believe. That's science and history. Well, you already talked about the history, but the science is involved as well, right?
Yeah, one of the things that's important in understanding the history of the guitar is it evolved from instruments that go back as far as we know, which is to prehistory, which is 5,000 years ago. Recorded history begins 5,000 years ago or 3000 BC. And we have a number of instruments that predate the guitar, but where we can track its direct lineage. In all those thousands and now currently hundreds of years, a lot of science and technology went into creating the guitars we know today. So one of the things that we really emphasize in the exhibit is the ability to learn about how electromagnetism creates the sound of an electric guitar. That requires magnets and electricity. How construction engineering allows a very thin piece of wood on the top of an acoustic guitar to vibrate and produce sound waves. So there are all kinds of interactives to look at that will not only show you how the guitar evolved, but how the actual pieces of the guitar work to create the sound that we all know and are familiar with.
Very cool. That's let's move to our next image here and tell us a little bit about what we're seeing. I know those are not guitars.
No,
correct?
but when we talk about instruments going back thousands of years, really the first instrument that introduces the guitar to the world in a way that we recognize is the lute, which is the instrument on your right. And that was a derivation of a Middle Eastern instrument called alud in Arabic. And Europeans took that word alud and made it lute. And the lute was popularized during the Renaissance times. And people who made lutes were called luthiers. And even today, a guitar player, a person who makes guitars is called a luthier. So we still have a very strong connection all those hundreds of years back to these instruments and the formation of the guitar we know today. So from something as seemingly remote from an electric guitar as an oud and a lute, we have the origins of most of today's classic music, or not classical, but classic rock pop music.
Cool. So here's one pretty, that's got to be one of the earliest 6-string guitars around, right?
It is. We, as you can see on the right, the guitar had lots of names throughout history. The guitar, guitar, more words than I can even pronounce. And they all ultimately became the guitar. But in those iterations, the guitar took many different forms. Sometimes it had 14 strings, sometimes it had 12 strings, sometimes it had 8 strings. Eventually, in the late 1700s, players sort of settled on 6 strings as being the best way to perform with this instrument. And a family in Italy, in Naples, called Fabricatores, were, as far as we can tell, the very first family to produce 6-string guitars, specifically as 6 strings, not 14-string guitars where you took off 8 and then got 6, but very definite 6 strings. And this one is one of only 17 existing Fabricatores. It was made in 1806, which is when Thomas Jefferson was president. So it shows you how old it is. And that's, as an example of one of the earliest, maybe very first 6 strings, we look at that as being a premier piece of our collection that we're bringing to Peoria.
That will be in, oh, great. Awesome. Do you know, would the tuning be standard tuning and what we tune a guitar now? Do you know?
No, it would have been, depending on the region and depending on the player, it could have been,
Okay.
it could have been what we know, you know, the E, A, D, G, B, E, but it's very likely that it was open tuned to maybe a G tuning or perhaps even a D tuning. It really wasn't until the early days of the 20th century that the tuning that we use today became pretty much standard. And even then, you know, people still mess around with tunings. There are a lot of people that don't tune to standard guitar tuning.
Let's see what we got up here next, HP. I think you might have already touched on some of this.
Well, yeah, also, you know, the guitar ended up having this incurved shape. You know, we look at it as having this kind of hourglass shape. And that really only came about a little over 100 years ago. Before that, it was kind of this, this oval shape that you saw with the oud and the lute. And even the word guitar, you know, even today, when we talk about things that are called the guitar, we have things that are outside of the standard 6-string. We have 12 strings. We have lap steels, which you play on your lap. You have pedal steels, which stand up and require pedals to operate. So the guitar, even though we standardized on it as a term, it actually encompasses a wide variety of instruments.
This is, I mean, we've already sort of talked about how old it is.
Yeah, I think especially in America, it's really important to realize that when the Spanish and then the English came over, they brought first and foremost farming implements, things to hoe and till the land, and weapons for obvious reasons, to protect themselves and to commit genocide or whatever else they were up to at the time. But the guitar was probably, after farm implements and weapons, the most common instrument that was brought over. And a lot of wealthy people brought their guitars, which, you know, were rare then. You brought it because it was a very special artifact. And the oldest one that we've tracked actually belonged to a Spanish soldier who was stationed in St. Augustine. And we have a record of his assets at the time of his death, which was in 1576, which was, you know, over 400, almost 450 years ago. And a guitar was one of the things he left behind. So that shows that even for soldiers, bringing a guitar over from the old world, Europe, to the new world was important because they couldn't make them here. They had to actually make room for them on ships and bring them over. So the guitar has been in America as long as anything, more than baseball, more than sports cars, more than a lot of things. It's really one of our most iconic pieces of Americana.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So we can jump here, but this is, well, you tell us about this strange instrument we're looking at here. I mean, you talked about pedal steel guitar, lap steel guitar. Right. For those of us that don't know about this.
Well, most people probably think of electric guitars as looking like this, or some variation of this. And they probably think that it was invented for blues or jazz or rock and roll. The fact of the matter is that the electric guitar was invented to play Hawaiian music. Hawaiian music was the most popular music in America from about 1915 to the early 1940s. And Hawaiian music is played with a lap steel, which is what that is, and it's played on your lap. So if you look at that and this, you play it on your lap and strum it, and you take a bar of metal or glass and play it along, you get this kind of glissandro sound, that Hawaiian sound. And it was created because as Hawaiian bands came to America, they became so popular, they went from playing these small, little, tiny rooms to begin playing clubs, to playing amphitheaters, to playing large theaters, that people would come in the thousands. And you could hear the hula singers, and you could hear the drums, and you could hear the piano. You couldn't hear the guy playing a guitar. And because it wasn't electrified, it was just this, you know, metal thing that was sitting on his lap. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing that.
So George Beecham, a man who had his own band, his own Hawaiian steel band, got tired of being the leader of the band and not having anybody hear him play the guitar. So he worked out a number of ways to try and amplify the guitar so that he could be heard. And that incorporates a lot of different iterations. He came up with one of the early ideas for the dobro, which is also a metal guitar that's very loud. But he discovered that if you magnified magnetized the strings of an electric string or of a steel string guitar, the vibrations of those strings could then be sent to an amplifier and turned into music. So he created this thing, the Rickenbacker 822, which is called the frying pan, because it looks like a frying pan. and
Yeah.
plugged it in. At the time, there were no amplifiers. He plugged them into very large radio sets, like, you know, our great grandparents had in their houses. And the guitar went from being the only instrument you couldn't hear in the band to, from that point forward, being the loudest instrument in ever.
Around what year is this?
This one is for the first year they produced them, which was 1934, and this is number 11. So they were patented in 1932 and produced in 1934. And that is the first mass-produced electric guitar. Not, you know, things that look like this, and not things that made rock and roll, but Hawaiian lap steel.
So this leads very nicely into, you know, I would really like to hear your thoughts on, you know, I think the guitar is seen as a very cool instrument now. I would imagine before it was electrified, maybe not so much the case.
You know, it's funny, the guitar, in the early 1900s, the guitar was very popular as an instrument that was played in homes, especially parlors, you know, front rooms where people gathered to sing and play. And so there was a huge market for parlor guitars, most of which actually were played by women. And as guitars got bigger and got louder, in order to be in bands where you could hear them, you know, this is a pretty big guitar.
Yeah.
They actually got too big for women, and men began to play them more and more. So the guitar's popularity in America really started to increase around the 1920s and 30s in acoustic. And I don't know if we have the reasons why it became so popular in terms of actual slides here. I don't remember. But we have like 3 or 4 different reasons why the guitar itself became so popular. So I don't know what your next slide is. No, so let's go back. Go back to him. You know, the guitar, we think there are just several reasons the guitar is so popular with people all around the world. One, it's portable. You can take this thing with you anywhere. You can carry it around with you, put it in a backpack, put it, you know, even check it on the plane, but I don't recommend that. And so as a portable instrument, it immediately outweighs the unportability, as it may be, of drums, of a piano,
Absolutely.
of a tuba. You can take it with you. So that's one. 2, it's one of the only instruments that you can sing and play at the same time. If you've got a flute or a violin, you can't sing and play while you're holding a violin and still have it be portable. So all these things tie together. So you can sing and play a piano, but you can't move the piano. You can sing and play drums, but you can't move the drums. You can carry a violin, but you can't sing and play at the same time. So you've got those 2 things to start with. 1, it's portable. Two, you can sing and play at the same time. The third is that it's the only instrument that, and its variations, that you have to embrace and hold next to you, pull next to you, as opposed to reaching out and hitting or pummeling. So, for example, you hold the guitar like this, and you bring it close to you, and you're holding it close to your chest, you're holding it around you. You've got to pull it close with both hands. If you're playing drums, you reach out and hit the drums. If you're playing piano, you reach out and hit the keys. If you're playing flute, you reach away from your body to be able to finger the flute. Those things make those instruments a little bit more distant feeling, perhaps emotionally. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't delve into that, but emotionally, they're not things that are required to be close to you. So you've got those three basic things. It's portable. You can sing and play at the same time. You got to hold it next to you and feel it when you play. The fourth one, which we just kind of added, is that it's the only instrument, if you're really passionate about it, it creates pain in order to play. When you learn to play the guitar, you get blisters on your fingers. Many people bleed by learning to play the guitar. They also have cramps in their hands. You don't get that. You can pound on a drum for days at a time and you are not going to have your fingers bleed. So you've got all these things that are very physically intimate about the guitar. And you don't get that with any other musical instrument in the world. So we think that's one of the reasons that, or we think those are several reasons, that people all around the world have adopted the guitar as something that's very special to them.
I know I do teach guitar and banjo and mandolin. All those string instruments cause some serious pain for beginning students.
Yes, they do.
It's interesting. It takes a while to build up some strength.
And that's one of the reasons the passion for the guitar is so strong, because once you've gotten past that pain point, you don't want to go back. You're going to keep playing. And it might be a cliche to say it's easy to give up the piano and walk away from it. If you put in the hours on a guitar and you feel the pain and you've gotten past that, you don't really want to go back and say, it wasn't worth it. You really do stick with it.
Yeah, you got to earn it.
Exactly.
So here we've touched on some of this, but for the next two sessions, next Wednesday, we'll talk about the acoustic guitar. And the Wednesday after that, we'll talk more about the electric guitar, just to set up for the next couple weeks. Here's something I find very interesting, and it's more about the artistic side and in the sculptural side. Could you explain, we see all these different guitars, different players use different styles of guitars. Why is this? What is really happening here?
Well, we go back to luthiers, and luthiers are the people who used to make lutes and now they make guitars. And each of them has their own style, and each of them wants to leave his or her own imprint on it. But the golden age of guitar making, at least in the electric guitar, was the late 1950s. And several shapes, and of all these, the one on your left is a Gibson Les Paul. The one in the middle, I don't have my glasses, but it looks like a 335, and the one on the right is a Telecaster. Each of those were very popular because they were the first introduced electric guitars. And they were designed, especially the Les Paul and the 335, to be able to be played easily and comfortably by the guitars. So they're curved in such a way that your fingers can get as far up on the neck to play as many notes as you can, and yet it still feels comfortable against your body. It's funny, the guitar on the right, the Telecaster, is actually a very flat guitar. And it's also the first mass-produced, commonly known guitar, and the first one to become popular in rock and roll. And it was very uncomfortable for players who were standing up playing rock or country or whatever, because it is a flat piece of wood and it would dig into their rib cages. So later guitars, especially the Fender Stratocaster, incorporated easier, nicer curves that form-fitted bodies better and allowed players to play a little more comfortably and with more efficiency. And since the late 50s, they almost delivered it a perfect hit right out of the box. I mean, those guitars have not changed design very much. You've got individual luthiers who play with those shapes in some really cool ways, which you can see at the museum. But these are kind of the essential building block shapes of the guitar.
So you've inducted several people that play and made these shapes popular. I kind of wanted to talk more about the guitars that they have than the actual player, but you you do honor somebody every year through the museum, a player of significance, correct?
Yes, we did. The exhibit is about the guitar, not the guitarist, although unless somebody's playing him, the guitar doesn't do much. And for instance, we have the Fender Stratocaster, which you see Bonnie Raitt playing on the left there. Mm-hmm. You know, instead of having any one particular Stratocaster in the exhibit, we have a classic Stratocaster and explain why people like Bonnie or Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan or Eric Clapton use that particular guitar. And then you have the 355, which B.B. King is holding and he made famous, which had an entirely different sound. And in this case, we actually do have a Lucille from B.B. King that we got before he died. But the sound of those guitars and what individual artists can do with them is really what makes them so important. How versatile are the individual guitars in the hands of a really skilled player? And, you know, not even in the hands of a skilled player, even a novice player can come up with some really interesting things. But each guitar has to appeal to them, not only in the way it feels and the sounds they can get out of it, but how it reflects their own kind of personality. I mean, Bonnie has played a Stratocaster forever and a day. It would be hard to imagine her playing, you know, a Gibson SG.
Absolutely. I don't think I've ever seen her with anything else.
No, and it's part of the personality. I mean, B.B. King played the 335 that he named Lucille. There's a long involved story about Lucille. One time he lost his first electric guitar in a fire, and then he bought another guitar, and he named every guitar after that Lucille, but he standardized on this one because it gave him the sounds that he wanted to hear in his ears that were coming from his fingers. So whenever you hear B.B. King in those really sharp, spiky, twangy sounds, he's pulling those out of a Gibson Lucille.
And the 335, I know a lot of players play those, but that's a hollow bodied guitar. It's not solid like.
It is. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's the perfect meeting of an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar, but it is hollow. This guitar is the same. It's actually hear that it's hollow, and it's got F holes in here which let the air out of it. And the shape of that guitar, as well as the resonance that takes place inside of it, gives it its own tone, which is different than the Stratocaster that Bonnie has, which is very hard and dense, and most of the sound comes from the pickups and from the player's fingers. Mm-hmm. So there are dynamics in having a hollow or semi-hollow body guitar versus a solid body electric guitar.
It's really great to see, you know, just you kind of already talked about the personality, but how what a player plays becomes so much a part of them.
Right.
And
well, I think any guitarist who's been playing, you know, after you learn the guitar, you learn how to play it, you learn your way around it, you start looking at it, you start listening to what sounds good, but you also start standing in front of the mirror and go, you know, this looks kind of good, or this doesn't look really good.
Yeah.
And it is an extension of your personality, not only in that you're playing music on it or that you're writing songs on it, but also that when you hold it and when you look at it, it feels like something you continually want to keep holding on to. So like a girlfriend or a boyfriend, you know, you want to embrace it and you like the way it feels.
Yeah.
So most guitarists who've been around recording for more than a decade or so tend to have signature guitars that you can associate with them. And it's hard to imagine them holding anything else because they become so identified personally with that shape and that sound of that individual guitar.
I don't feel like there's any other instruments that really take on personalities like guitars.
Well, again, it's hard, there aren't, it's hard to have a lot of different saxophones and tell the difference.
Yeah, exactly.
And, the same is true of violin. Certainly there are many, many different manufacturers,
Yeah.
but they aren't visually evident in terms of their difference. Again, because you hold the guitar close and it's facing forward, especially in concert or on posters or, in TV shows, whatever, you're seeing a large part of the guitar. So it becomes part of the performer's visual effect. And I think people like Taylor Swift has done a really good job of using the guitar on stage to show that, I'm a musician and you're going to see me with this out there. So it reinforces the fact that the guitar is really a part of what the person is trying to express.
Really cool. So I think we'll kind of wrap up tonight's session here with talking about your experience as the chief editor of Guitar Magazine. I mean, what a cool job. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to what it was like to be a part of this magazine?
It was a great job, probably the best office job I ever had. There's something about being involved with any organization that centers around something you love. And having played the guitar since I was 15 years old, I've always loved being around it. And because I was a writer after I got out of college, I tried to gravitate towards writing about things that would let me write more about the guitar. And I wrote about high technology and synthesizers and how performers use them. And eventually that got me to writing more and more about guitar. And when I went to work in a Guitar Magazine, which is just outside, or was just outside New York City, it was a great place to be, simply because New York City had night after night after night of concerts and artists coming in from around the world. And so me and the other people I worked with, all the other editors, would spend our evenings going out seeing performers, many of them famous, some of them not, but indulging our passion for the guitar. So being in a publication where you could sit and chat with David Gilmour and then go out and see him play Madison Square Garden that night, or
unbelievable,
talking to Tony Iommi and see him play with Sabbath play that night. All of those were pretty amazing things. And now that magazines are gone, it was a really rarefied, not gone, but almost gone. It was a really rarefied time. And it's one that, I look back on fondly. I think everybody should get the chance to spend time working around the thing that they love.
I definitely had a subscription to this magazine when I was a learning player.
Right.
So thanks for doing a good job.
Well, thanks. There was many of us who worked on it. I was just glad to be part of it.
What a great thing to be a part of. Well, I think that's about it for our time tonight, HP. I don't think we have any questions, actually.
Okay.
So I think maybe, if you're tuning in tonight and you think of something you want to ask HP, we'll be back at you next Wednesday at the same time to talk about the history of the acoustic guitar, correct?
Right, of how this thing came to be.
So HP, I got to show you this before we leave, and maybe we can talk more about it next time. But this is actually a guitar I built with a luthier in town.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It's an OM model or design.
Right.
Shape.
That's gorgeous. Making a guitar is not an easy thing to do.
No, it was not easy in any way.
It's not something, even after all my decades, I would attempt to do. I leave that to the professionals.
Now you could do it. I had a lot of help.
Well, it's a it's an amazing thing when you get a guitar after someone's built it for you and you see what it took to build that and then what you can do with that instrument after you've got it in your hands.
It's unbelievable what the makers of these instruments do. It's not really apparent until you really get into the guts of what goes into it. But I just thought I wanted to show you that before we got off here.
Well, make sure you bring it next week.
I will. I definitely will. Well, it was great having you, HP, and I look forward to talking to you for the next over the next several weeks. Thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight, and I hope you enjoyed the talk here.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Zach. Everybody have a safe week.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good night, HP.
You too. Bye-bye.